Hi Guavabees, and welcome to another episode of the Dear GUAVABEAN podcast. I'm Francesca, and with me is Claire.
Hi.
And today's question is from Carly, who asks, Dear GUAVABEAN, I'm working with a difficult client. She is highly critical of all the work I do, and I barely get a compliment when I do great work, which is most of the time. She also has been casually pushing more and more work on me without me realising. Now I'm spending more time on tasks for her than any of my other clients, and she is my lowest paying one. My dilemma is that I do enjoy the work I do for her, and I'm learning a lot, otherwise I would have walked away by now. What should I do? This is a pretty difficult one. What is your kind of first thoughts, Claire?
Yeah, a very difficult one. My first thought is that I can really empathize. I've been here many times with difficult clients. I know the frustration and the feeling of like, no matter what I do, it's not good enough. Those kind of clients that are just really critical and difficult to work with.
Yeah.
My first suggestion or recommendation would just be to make sure you have a contract, or even if it's just a Word document, you always have to have the agreement in writing, because it sounds like she's pushing more and more work. And if you don't have that in writing, it can be very hard to address this with the client in a way that they realize that they've overstepped.
Yeah, it sounds to me, I agree with you. It sounds to me that maybe things weren't cemented in writing, perhaps, which is a really important step, I think, especially maybe new freelancers maybe are a bit unsure about this as well. I think it tends to be something which can be seem quite overwhelming, actually, if you're first starting out as a freelancer. I'm seeing an increasing trend, actually, in the kind of freelancing industry where some people are feeling like they don't need a contract with a client because they think a conversation is enough. I would always suggest, basically, I just echo you, Claire. A contract is really important. It doesn't have to be super wordy. It just has to be outlining the project that you're undertaking with a client, and just really the finer points, how much you're looking to charge, the hours, what to do if something goes wrong, that kind of thing. And really it just makes sure that you're both on the same page and that there's no misunderstandings about the work, which there often can be in a conversation as opposed to when it's all written out.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the most important thing to get into a contract is, number one, the tasks and responsibilities that are included in your agreement. And then number two, the amount of hours that are expected. If you are billing on an hourly rate, you need to be really clear that, I'm doing 20 hours a month, and these hours include these tasks, task number 1, 2, and 3. And if you get it in writing, and if the client signs off on it, then you have a really strong position to go back to them later and say, hey, I noticed that you've been asking me to do just a little bit more than was in our original agreement. That's totally fine. I'm really happy to support you. That's just going to be a little additional hours. So maybe I can amend our contract and send you an updated version. If you have that contract, it gives you a really good foot to stand on. Is it a leg to stand on? It just gives you
a leg, a leg to stand on.
Yeah, it gives you a really good leg to stand on. And like you said, a lot of people have been skipping over contracts lately. We can include in the notes a really great contract, a free contract link that I use for my clients. And I think everybody should use a contract, even if, like I said, even if it's just a Word document. That is like the number one thing you have to do to protect yourself from these kind of situations.
Oh, absolutely. I'm not really sure why I'm seeing a kind of increasing trend of people who don't need a contract. I mean, or think they don't need a contract. I'm thinking maybe it's just it's that sort of overwhelm, like you said, how you just use like a really simple contract. It doesn't have to be this huge document. I think maybe some freelancers are worried that their client may reject working with them if they're sending them this huge document of pages and pages of terms. And you should always be comfortable with working with a client, and you should absolutely have it in writing. I use a very simple, plain English contract as well myself. So I would always recommend that this is like step one as well, Claire. What would you think about perhaps when you have a conversation with your client, say you've written up a contract, they've signed it, you're both happy, then later on down the line, the work changes slightly. Would you think that would be okay just as long as you've got it in kind of email terms, like in writing, that you're actually changing the scope slightly? Because I personally think this is okay as long as you've got it written down and there's a conversation that you can both refer back to, just so that you're on the same page. What's your stance on this?
I think if it's a small change, if it's just a little task, a minor change, that's no big deal. But if they are adding more work and more hours to your schedule, I think it's worth acknowledging that in writing. And I would even go into updating the contract. I know that you could just have a conversation in email, but I think if it's a significant increase, you want to make sure, number one, that you're respecting your own time and that you are signaling to this client that you take this work very seriously, and a little increase, even if it's just a little increase, is still an increase, right? That's still more time, that's still more work. Even if you don't update the contract, you definitely should have a conversation and acknowledge that this is an addition to the original agreement.
That's a really good point. I think maybe sometimes as well, clients aren't fully aware that they have asked for more and more and more as time has gone on. I don't think it's intentional a lot of the time. I do think that because somebody gets comfortable with working with you and, naturally the scope of a project can change depending on, what the results are and what the feedback is. And there's lots of things that go into a project. It depends what kind of work you do. But I don't always think it is intentional. I think it's a good point you made that having it in writing does show that you're a serious freelancer, but also it shows the client that you kind of, you don't want to be messed around, for want of a better phrase. I think that they're less likely to ask more of you without, say, paying you more or expecting it to take longer if you are quite upfront with it. And I think it's an important thing to remember. I think especially as new freelancers tend to feel like they might be easier to push around or might have a bit less confidence than someone who's done it for years. And that's another important step, I think, is kind of asserting yourself and just making it clear that, your time is money, as you said, Claire.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's a lot of nice ways to do that. One of my clients actually taught me how she does it. And anytime someone asks us for anything that's out of scope, our typical response, if we want to do it, is sure, no problem. That will just be an additional X amount, And that gives people the option of saying, great, let's do it. Or, you know what, maybe I'm not ready to pay that yet. And so if you put that back on the client, then they can make that choice. Am I willing to pay more for this extra task? But if you just say yes to it, you're setting yourself up for a difficult conversation later on down the road if the client continues to push tasks on you.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's a good thing to kind of frame it positively as well. So, like you mentioned, instead of kind of making it this big deal where you're like, oh, well, I could do, but it's probably going to cost you this. It's like that automatically sets it up for like them more likely to say no and, causing a difficult conversation, like you say. You're working on equal terms with each other, and I think it's a conversation that should be had. Now, what about if it's a conversation where you're finding it a bit tricky? So Carly, for example, has said she's a bit worried. She likes working with the client, so she doesn't kind of want to create that awkward situation, but she knows something needs to change. How would you kind of broach that subject with a client if maybe they're not aware that this is the situation that's happening?
Yeah, absolutely. I've had to talked to clients about this in the past. And what I find works the best for me is to write an email first, just so I can organize my thoughts. I can frame it in a way that is positive and, non-blamey or judgy. And I always try to have a friend just read over that email if possible and just give me their opinion on how it sounds before I send it. And so I frame out all my thoughts in an email, and I always make sure to present solutions. I don't just want to tell the client, this is the problem, this is how I feel about it, what do we do? I don't want to do that because it puts a lot of effort on them to now come up with a solution. So I always try to think of, okay, how can we solve this? Maybe I need to do this, or maybe we can do that. And so in the email, I present the problem, and then I present some possible solutions, and then I invite the client to get on a call with me and discuss more, and let's settle on a solution that's a win-win for both of us. I think if you approach it in this way, the client will understand that you have their best interests in mind and you're trying to find a win situation. You're not just trying to get out of the project or get more money from them. You're actually trying to help them. Not all clients will see it that way, but that's what I would suggest.
I love it. I think it's a responsible way to deal with a situation like this. And I know we always talk about being a human, being a person, you're talking to each other as people. I think it's also good to bear in mind that if you let your emotions come into it too much, it can create like a negative vibe, or, it might make it more awkward than it actually needs to be. We have to remember that as freelancers, we are running a business. And so I love that you mentioned that you want a friend to overlook, an email that you might be looking to send. I do this. I ask someone if they could just take a look and would they find it a little bit like I'm getting at the client or I'm coming across upset, because you don't want that. You don't want to create this awkward tension between you and a client if it could be easily solved by just stepping back, taking your emotions out of it and making the best decision for your business. I love that you suggested thinking of some solutions. I think it's really shows sort of that you're a proactive freelancer. And I think it does matter when you're speaking to a client. It might be difficult to mention that you maybe feel a little overworked or that you're taking on too much. So again, it just provides that sort of, you're almost extending an olive branch. You're like, well, I'm not actually having a go at you. I just want us to solve this so we're both happy. I think it's great that you suggest doing this in writing first, because, if you go straight into a conversation as well, not only could you say something maybe that you don't mean, or it might come across that you're upset or something like that, but then you also have no record of what the problem is. It's best to have it in writing, as we already said, and I think that can also help towards that too.
Yeah, absolutely. For the client also, it gives them time to think about their response and to think about some solutions and how they would like to approach the problem. One way that I've noticed when I worked as a project manager, I was working under another project manager, and scope creep is a big problem.
Oh, yeah.
If some people don't know what scope creep is, that's just like the scope of work. Usually when you start a project, I was working with websites, and so when we start a website development project, we have a scope of work, and it's a document that lists out everything that we're going to do on this project. And then if a client goes over that, which they always do, then we can refer back to this document. But what I learned from the project manager I was working for was she would list out everything that was beyond the scope. Like, she wouldn't just say, hey, you're pushing the scope a little bit. She would be like, here's everything that's in our scope, and here's everything in the last 7 days that you've asked us to do that is beyond the scope. And when you can see a visual, like, she would write it out and she would highlight everything beyond the scope in red. So it was very clear, and it was a very powerful visual for the client to see, like, oh my God, I've actually asked for so many things that are way beyond the scope. And if you don't show them that visual, then it's kind of just loosely hanging in the air. You're saying you're giving me too much work. They're saying this is within your contract. It could be just a little bit up in the air. If you actually get it down in writing, some clients will see that and really respect it, because it's hard to argue when you see it in writing like that.
Oh, yeah, that sounds like such a important way to kind of show your client what the boundaries are. Like, for example, if you were to have like a design brief for a piece of work that you're going to do, if you're a graphic designer, say you're going to design a logo, if you were looking at a design brief, your client would say, I like this font, I like this design, but I don't like this kind of design. That's sort of the same thing, really. It seems strange that I personally have never come across that kind of boundary setting before. I love that. I think that's a really important thing to maybe discuss with your client if you don't already. I'll definitely be taking that on board. I think that's a really valuable piece of information to include in a conversation like that, most definitely.
Yeah, absolutely. Especially if you worry that the client might be confrontational about it, then having that list gives you a little bit of backup.
Right, exactly. It kind of does away with that ambiguity, It's like sometimes things can be taken in two different ways it depends on who you speak to. If it's actually set in stone like that, then you really can't argue, can you?
Yeah, absolutely. And then I guess just the last piece of advice, because it sounds like, sometimes you get into a project and it starts out great and then it ends up difficult and you already don't have a contract. So all of this advice about like getting a contract is a little too late. And so if you find yourself in this situation, you don't have a contract, you don't know what to do, I don't think it's too late to try to introduce a contract. But also, I think it's worth thinking about, now I'm going to say this very gently because I don't think anybody should fire a client easily. Like, I think this is something you should think about, and you should definitely give the client 2 or 3 chances to fix the relationship and to fix the issues. But you should also keep it in the back of your mind that this is time that you're spending. And not just that, but you're building up resentment, and that resentment or stress can leak into your other projects. Like Harley mentions, she's spending more time on this client than any of the other clients, and she's the lowest paying one. And so if you think about that, just from a financial point of view, that's not a good situation to be in, because she's potentially losing out on money that she could be making if she were to be putting more effort into the clients that are paying her more. And so you have to kind of consider this, even though you enjoy the client, even if you enjoy the work, even if she's still a paying client, you have to ask yourself, at what point do I let go? At what point is this no longer profitable for me? And so what I do is I always give a client at least 2 or 3 chances, have a phone call with them, talk to them about the problem. And if a few tries and they still can't fix it, then I think maybe you just need to have an honest conversation and say, maybe we're just not a good fit.
Unfortunately, that does happen sometimes, doesn't it? And again, I think it's so important to have the conversation first before you make any rash decisions. Firing a client is never easy, but it is something that probably most freelancers will have to do in their career. So it can be a case of simply weighing up the pros and cons. Do you think it's worth sticking with the client? As Carly mentioned, she's learning a lot from the client. She does enjoy the work. So is it worth, hanging on and having a conversation about what can be done? Sometimes the client may not even be aware that you're upset by this, or you feel overworked, or that what you agreed originally isn't the work that you're doing now. Sometimes the client may have 100 things that they need to do, and they're simply just telling you what they want you to do, and they think that's okay. So it is really important to just set the boundaries, have a conversation. But if it gets to the point where you feel it's unreasonable and they're not willing to kind of budge, even though you're doing a lot for them and they're not doing a lot in return, it is something that you may have to think about. But remember that just because you feel a certain way about something doesn't mean they do. So you have to kind of air those grievances and have, as you say, an honest conversation. It's so important.
Yeah, super important, especially if you feel like a client is being critical and you don't get a compliment. I mean, obviously, it's nice to get compliments. It's nice to get appreciated. You can't expect that from all your clients. But if that is something that's really important to you, like if you're really proud of your work and you want clients to acknowledge the good work that you do, I think it's worth having a conversation about that too, and just airing your feelings about it, but doing it in a way that is, professional and respectful, and that will move you forward in a positive direction with this client. And then also keeping in mind that sometimes it doesn't always work out. Like sometimes you just get difficult clients who are critical and demanding and difficult. And sometimes the best thing that you can do for yourself is just to walk away. But like I said, and like you said, you always have to have a conversation. You always have to give them a chance. Give them an opportunity to understand the problem, to make it right. And then only if you feel that there's no way forward, then consider ending the arrangement.
Yeah. And one last thing I will add is that some clients, and certainly many clients I've personally worked with, have never worked with a freelancer before. So it may just be that they maybe don't understand the boundaries. If you have an employee and they're salaried and they work a job description that's written down, that's really different to having a contract with a freelancer that only does a certain amount in a certain amount of time in a month, for example. It's, again, all about having the contract, having a conversation and just understanding each other. And I think that's a good point. I know obviously Carly is already working with this client, but for any new freelancers that are listening, it's important to have that conversation and that you're on the same page before you then work with a client. That's always the advice I would give, that you fully understand both of your expectations, essentially.
Yeah, really good points. So this is such a tough one. I feel so much for Carly because I know what she's going through. All I can say is that these experiences, you kind of have to have them so that you learn what to do better next time. If we didn't deal with difficult clients, then we wouldn't learn how to set boundaries, how to write contracts, how to not let people push tasks on you that are not in your contract. All of this stuff is freelancing 101. And you kind of have to go through this in order to get the skills and the experience that you need to avoid these circumstances in the future.
100%. I think it's an important lesson for any freelancers to understand that there are going to be these uncomfortable situations, and it makes you stronger. It makes you better at what you do. And, if nobody made mistakes, if nobody went through these uncomfortable times, we wouldn't be able to learn from our mistakes and know what to do next time. So, yeah, I agree. And I think that we can always support each other as freelancers as well by knowing and learning from these mistakes too, and difficult situations. We hope this episode has helped you figure out what to do next. Now it's your turn, Guava Bees. Have you got a burning question that only Guava Bean can help answer? Submit your question in the sandbox or on the website, and we could be answering yours in the next episode. That's all from us. To all creatives, rebels, and digital nomads, keep working online and living free.
Want to know more about the Freelancer Sandbox? Visit guavabean.com/sandbox to start your free trial now.